Hi, I'm Antonio Tijerino of the Hispanic Heritage Foundation and also a member of the HTTP Advisory Board, which means I'm doubly interested in empowering our Latinx communities in the tech sector. Our focus at HHF is education, workforce development, leadership, and culture through our innovative programs like Code as a Second Language, where we're teaching 100,000 youths how to code. We also host an entire continuum in the coding space, from CSL academies to coding summits, mentoring, networking, hackathons, and other tech challenges we're trying to meet, and also placing our talent into tech jobs. That effort was challenging before COVID in terms of connectivity at schools and community centers. Now we have to work with underrepresented communities at home, virtually, where access to Wi-Fi and devices is even more critical to basic education and workforce development. This isn't about streaming entertainment. This is about basic education and opportunity. The digital divide, or as I call it, the tech equity gap, has gotten much bigger, and it's hitting our minority communities at a disproportionate rate, just like the viruses. That tech equity gap is negatively impacting our communities who are relying more than ever on the internet, not only for education, but in job opportunities, access to information, healthcare, and can even limit our ability to mobilize during this time of social unrest. Collectively, we have to meet the moment. This is not the time to be patient. We need a sense of urgency. And our most precious commodity, our K through 12 students, are one of the biggest populations that's suffering the most. The Hispanic Heritage Foundation did a national study that found that Latino students were most likely to say their grades suffered because of lack of access to broadband. Most likely to say they couldn't finish their homework because of lack of access to Wi-Fi. Most likely to use a smartphone to complete their homework or fill out college applications. We also found that teachers said Latinx parents were most difficult to communicate with because of the parents' lack of access to the internet, just to send emails and share updates about their children. It was not a language barrier. It was an internet barrier. And again, this was before COVID. The chances of Latinx students having both a computer and high-speed internet access is about half of non-Latinos. Remember the summer slide where students would lose 25% of what they learned over the 2.5 months of summer vacation? Well, that slide is now falling off a cliff in terms of our students because they're going to be at least 9 months until most kids are able to get back to the classroom. And a recent study indeed found that Latinx students are at risk of falling 9.2 months behind their schoolwork. Many of our students live in rural areas, urban centers, low-income communities, border towns, and other challenged by the digital divide. Additionally, the future of work is dependent on how quickly we can get everyone connected to broadband. If this digital gap persists, studies show that it will have a negative consequences on 76% of Black people and 62% of Latinos being shut out or underprepared for 86% of U.S. jobs by 2045. And then you wonder why Black and Latinos are so dramatically underrepresented in tech jobs. Mystery solved. But now we need to solve the problem. I'm grateful to HTTP and its members and supporters because they understand that our community's ability to connect to broadband for job skills training in the digital age is inextricably linked to our economy, just as it is with our education. We are proud to partner with HTTP for this year's Digital Inclusion Summit to have these important conversations about the future of work. The impact of COVID and its impact on jobs, the economy, and other challenges have raised important questions about the nature of work, the support systems available if we are unable to work or retire, and the skills that we need to succeed in today's job market and in the jobs of the future. As we consider these questions, technology and access to broadband continues to play a central role in determining who has access to flexible remote work opportunities, access to an always-on medium to learn new skills and apply for new higher-paying jobs, and who's able to benefit from our digital economy. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted our economies and societies and has increased that tech equity gap I had mentioned between the most privileged and the most vulnerable, leaving us all to answer the question, how can we rebuild the world of work in a way that gives people more opportunities than before and decreases inequalities? Now I'm happy to turn the mic over to HTTP Executive Director Alejandro Roark for a fireside chat with Adrian Haro, CEO of the Workers Lab, where they will explore the future and dignity of work and how together we can build an inclusive and empowered workforce of the future. And also, thank you for your leadership, Alejandro, and your tireless work on these issues.
Thank you, Antonio. As the nature of work changes, so has the workplace. Work as we have known it in every sector of the American economy is being disrupted by new and emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, robotics, and big data. Traditional employment is beginning to look a lot more like gig work, with unpredictable work schedules and more uncertain working conditions and compensation. These changes have broad implications that are fueling deep economic anxiety that's only magnified by deeply embedded structural inequalities. What's worse is that as today's labor market continues to change, our workforce policies and systems that are supposed to support workers have failed to keep up with the changing nature of employment and employer-worker arrangements. Many types of workers are affected by these seismic changes, from the creative professional working gig to gig, to the retail or restaurant worker, the home care worker who is negotiating a price and availability with customers through an app, even the construction worker or the long-haul trucker who is worried about a future of driverless vehicles. But these changes are not impacting everybody equally. Women, people of color, immigrants, and people with disabilities disproportionately bear the brunt of potential displacement, exacerbating inequality overall. To better understand the dynamic nuance needed in order to effectively promote better policy solutions that address the real-world needs of today's workers, I sat down with Adrian Haro, CEO of the Workers Lab, and Alejandra Montoya-Boyer from the National Association of Counties. Please join me as we watch some highlights from those conversations.
My name's Adrian. I'm the CEO at the Workers Lab, where our purpose is to give new ideas about increasing power for workers a chance to succeed and to flourish. I started at the Workers Lab in 2017 as our managing director, supporting the vision of our founder, Carmen Rojas. And really at that time, the Workers Lab was a fiscally sponsored project of a larger foundation. Super scrappy startup. We didn't know if it was going to go anywhere or become a thing, and it has. And so over the last 3 or so years have really worked to build this organization from scratch. Everything from building out our terrific programs to a budget, a benefit strategy, payroll, all of that stuff, which is a lot of work. Anybody who's ever started anything knows that building something is a lot of luggage, let me tell you. But the one thing that, but I've never gotten tired, right? The one thing that I love about this job is that I get to do it all in service of making the lives of working people better. And that is really special to me, mostly because of where I grew up and how I grew up. So I grew up on the east side of Los Angeles. I actually just moved back here. It's a little town called Pico Rivera, California. And Mexicans live here. Mexican Americans live here. And at a very young age, I had the example through my mother of service and was like pretty intense about service as a kid. And it never left. It is the reason why I have done everything you just read about in my bio and continue to do today in service of making the lives of working people better. My passion for this stuff, this issue really does come from my parents, both immigrants from Guadalajara, Mexico. My dad was a janitor for most of my life, and my mom was a seamstress. And we always had everything we needed, right? But I knew that it took a lot, and they worked really, really hard to make sure that I had what I needed. And so I don't take that for granted at all. And I think about that almost every day in this job when I'm thinking about how best to serve all of the workers that you talked about in your intro, which, as you know, given the global pandemic, are experiencing a really undignified amount of burden and pain at this moment. Our purpose is to give new ideas about increasing worker power a chance to succeed and to flourish. And if you think about that purpose, what it's really premised on is the idea that there isn't enough innovation happening in service of working people, and in particular, low-wage working people, largely of color, right? And so we give new ideas for them and from them a chance. And we do that primarily as an intermediary funder through two core programs. The first is our signature program called the Innovation Fund, which is a grant competition that we host 3 times a year, really to like put out a big call and say like, what is out there, right? To sort of cast a super wide net around new ideas and innovation taking root all over the country in service of working people. We throw those ideas through a competition and then we fund them. The second programs, like you mentioned, Alejandro, are these design sprints that we do. We started doing them in partnership with Google. Indeed, the design sprint methodology is something that came out of Google Ventures. And so it's essentially a process to get a product to market, a tech solution to market very quickly. And so we've taken that methodology inside the Workers Lab and have applied it to a social change goal, building a piece of tech that aims to serve the purpose of making people's lives better. We've done that last year. Our first one, we did it on creating the first of its kind sort of emergency cash platform to serve gig workers. We did that pre-COVID, and then suddenly COVID happened. And as you might imagine, given the sort of focus on emergency cash, the learnings from that design sprint became really important. And the technology became really important, right? How do you use technology to serve workers in ways that we've never had to serve workers before? And we were really fortunate to be able to lean on all of those learnings. You know, I mentioned the Innovation Fund. Inside, more like I love the programs, but what I love the most about working here at the Workers Lab is our values. Really, we are a majority, first generation, person of color, queer organization. And while, you know, that's really important, it sounds super cool, but it's really, really important for 2 reasons. First, it sort of disrupts the notion of who's typically equipped to do innovation, right? As we see it, it is not a white tech bro in the Silicon Valley. In fact, 74%, the vast majority of the people that we give money to, the innovators on the ground, are people of color, and very specifically women of color. So we wear that with a badge of honor because it's important. It's important that we show employers, policymakers, public sector leaders, folks in the social sector, who's best equipped because of their proximity and because of their lived experiences as Latinos or as other communities of color, who's best equipped to actually solve problems in this country. And as we see it, it's people who look like me and you. In terms of how we got here, you know, the great debate, right? But like for me, it's really personal, right? Like my parents, I mentioned, they're in their late 70s now. My parents came here at a time when we as a country were truly committed to show what dignity while working looked like, right? That job of the past where like you got a job and you had health benefits and you could go on vacation for a week, you had health insurance, right? It's not always the story you hear now, right? But that's how it was here. That was the deal when you got here and worked here by and large in and around the 1970s. And as I see it, that's when things started to change, right? Choices were made by people in power that really started to close off opportunity for working people. And those choices have, I don't need to say this, but like have adversely affected Latinos and other communities of color in really deep and long-standing ways. And so I believe how we got here was a series of choices. The first was about corporate greed, right? Leaders of corporations began to untether their fates as a business with the fates of their workers, right? Fractured it. The second choice, as I see it, was about the role of our government. Politicians, corporate leaders, academics chose to advance what I believe was an aggressive project to delegitimize the role of government in this country. I went to college on a Pell Grant, right? My whole life, I would not be here if it wasn't for government. I believe deeply in its role. The third choice, as I see it, was about one, to decimate labor unions. Worker power was sort of begun to see as like a liability, right? And so 30% of working people were members of unions in the 1960s. That was 18% in the 1980s, 14% in the early 2000s, and today barely 10% of working people are members of unions. So what were we left with because of all of that, right? The mass globalization of our jobs, of American jobs, wage stagnation, you know, a really big steep decline in organized labor, which has contributed, you know, there was a time, Alejandro, when work in this country was seen as a vehicle for participation in our democracy, right? And certainly it is no longer, that is no longer the case. And that decline in labor union membership, I think, has contributed largely to that. And I'll wrap by just saying that, like, if I think that how we got here was a series of choices that were, let's just give them anti-worker choices, then certainly it's time to make new choices. And to get to the last part of your question, how can we do that? How do we interact with sort of actors, people in power across industries and sectors? Our role is to give those folks proof by funding the work that we fund, even if it's a little bit, that things can look and be different in this country as it pertains to our economy, as it pertains to how workers live in this country. Like I said, then that's like a nice tie into the purpose, right? And so we work every day to give new ideas a chance and then to share the learnings from those ideas with all of those folks that you mentioned in your question.
I think one of the challenges is that the future of work has like a very specific narrative talking about automation and artificial intelligence, like the robots are coming for our jobs and they're displacing workers, which is partially true. That's definitely not true. But really the future of work is getting at a much bigger picture that work, the nature of work, how we define our workplaces is changing. And that's true for many reasons, because of demographic shifts, because of you know, now with the pandemic, the increase in remote work opportunities, and just a lot of different things that are shifting the way that work happens in this country and globally. And a part of that means that we are dismantling or a lot of our protections for workers need to change with it. The policies that we have in place for traditional workers just aren't enough when we're seeing so much change in workplaces right now. And so what that means is we need to ensure, you know, proper worker protections, proper opportunities for wages and incomes that are livable, benefits that are necessary that come along with our employment or are disconnected from our employment, and really just to ensure that that jobs and work allow for economic dignity in the way that we reimagined that in the New Deal and in the 30s and 40s. We're going through another transformation now that our policies need to play some catch up with our workplace cultures. We have these labor protections born out of the New Deal in the 30s and 40s. And I think back then we never would have been able to dream the type of economy we have now, with obviously with the internet and with automation, artificial intelligence, but also with the, you know, dismantling of a lot of the protections that came with the New Deal, and with more and more people being forced into the gig economy and into non-traditional work that ensures that they're not protected. They don't have wage or, you know, minimum wage is an example, and when 50% of our workers are going to soon be classified as non-traditional gig workers, and they don't have the protections, they don't have the benefits that come with traditional employment, our economy is definitely going to be on a long road to recovery, both from this pandemic, but also just as we look at the transitions coming from the future of work. I mentioned benefits because one of the other federal policies that needs to be considered in a new administration comes from benefit portability or just a modernization of our benefit systems. So one of the things that the Biden-Harris administration has talked about is innovative ideas around, disconnecting our benefits to our employment. So much like Obamacare did with healthcare, there are ideas and innovative practices coming out of how to ensure that workers have other types of benefits like retirement savings, paid family leave, flexible spending accounts, all of the different benefits that come with traditional employment. There should be similar opportunities, maybe a federal marketplace. Certain states already have marketplaces that are similar, where someone could buy into those different federal, the different benefits that they need. At the end of the day, the federal government is going to be the make or break for a lot of these protections. We need to see a massive transformation in our federal protection systems for workers. And a lot of these changes really do have to come from the federal government. State and local governments also play a huge role. States oversee a lot of the workforce, states and local governments actually both oversee workforce development boards, education systems, and a lot of the reskilling and retraining that'll have to happen as people move through different jobs at a newer and faster rate than before. People don't stay in jobs for 30 years like they used to. And so having lifelong learning opportunities, reskilling, retraining opportunities, states and local governments really oversee a lot of that. They get funding from the federal government through things like through WIOA and other federal grant opportunities. But the other thing is our infrastructure needs to play a lot of catch up. I'm sure the Digital Inclusion Summit will include conversations like broadband access and digital equity. But if local governments aren't able to provide their residents the infrastructure like broadband access, education access, community college, post-secondary educational opportunities, then we're not really going to be able to see the required pieces for workers to be able to continue into this new economy. As digital inclusion advocates, I think it's really critical that, one, we're just getting the voices of our communities and our stories told. At the end of the day, Congress, they're responsive to us and our needs, and if they don't know what we need, they can't do their jobs. And so just telling our stories, ensuring that people really understand what gig workers are, who they are, what they're really doing. I think there's some false narratives. For example, I think some people think that it's just people with a side hustle so that they can get their startup going, or it's, folks fresh out of college that are wanting to become artists or actors, and they're using this as supplemental income. But for a lot of people, that's their sole income, and it is necessary to be able to pay for fundamentals like housing, food, raise their kids. I mean, we're pushing more and more workers, particularly low-income workers, into these positions, and people really need to understand it. So there's the piece of just telling our stories, and particularly for communities of color, for Latinx communities, for Indigenous communities. Like, we just got to be ensuring that our policymakers know who we are. The second piece of that is we need to make sure that Congress is responsive to us as people and not just to big corporations. That's much harder or easier said than done. And at the end of the day, some of these big companies have billions and millions and billions of dollars to put behind lobbying efforts and campaign efforts. But if we can get op-eds drafted, if we can get some digital campaigns going, I mean, we've seen social media transform how campaigning works. And so using those tools to our benefit to be able to advocate for the policies that we want to support and see enacted. And lastly, just like holding our leaders accountable when our leaders fail to be responsive to our community's needs. We need to be able, including our democratic, to put a partisan spin on it, but including the leaders that we elect or that we support, we need to be able to hold them accountable when they're not doing enough to support the communities. And worker protections is a fundamental issue right now amongst a million other issues, but we will not have a successful economic recovery if we don't include worker protections for gig workers. It's just a fact. There's too many people in this new economy that if they're not included in the recovery, our economic recovery won't be successful.
Hi, it's Alejandro again. This concludes the program for our first and hopefully yearly Digital Inclusion Summit. I want to take this opportunity to extend a heartfelt thank you to all of our partner organizations, our underwriting partners, the leadership of HTTP's CEO Roundtable, and all of you for sharing your afternoon with us. The COVID-19 global health crisis has taught us all that almost every facet of American culture is insufficiently prepared to meet our growing digital needs. As the burdens of the pandemic continues to fall most heavily on those most historically disconnected, it is up to us to continue the conversation and to work with policymakers, regulators, internet service providers, and online platforms to work collaboratively to build new solutions in order to achieve an inclusive tech future that serves all people equally. Today's program was just a jumping off point to establish a shared understanding of what's at stake for our communities, but it is also a call to action to become a part of our country's connectivity story. We can no longer look away from the role that the internet plays in our lives. The internet is an essential and principal building block for success. COVID has served as an inflection point for action, but it is up to us working together to establish a bipartisan, cross-sector, collaborative, and unifying strategy that prioritizes our values of connection, inclusion, representation, safety, and fluency, and that establishes a consistent and reliable regulatory framework to ensure that everyone, regardless of race, ability, income, gender, orientation, faith, country of origin, has access to and can benefit from our 21st century digital economy. Tech and telecommunications policy gives us the opportunity to build the inclusive infrastructure of the future and is the best pathway towards achieving a new era of shared prosperity. I invite you all to stay connected by following @HTTP_policy on Twitter and Instagram. And I hope to see all of you at the live after show starting immediately after the simulcast. So until then, until we see each other again, whether it's in person or online, remember to get connected, to tune into the conversation, and to speak out, because the future needs our help. Thank you again for joining today's program, and see you next time.